What happens when a man who dreams of stars walks into a trap set by a host chasing cheap laughs? The stage lights burned hot on Jimmy Kimmel Live, the crowd buzzing with anticipation. Elon Musk sat in the guest chair, his sharp eyes scanning the set. He had come to talk about Tesla's new electric truck, a machine that could change how people thought about power and freedom. But something felt wrong. Jimmy Kimmel leaned back in his chair, a smirk curling his lips, his fingers drumming the desk like a man who knew a secret. The air crackled with unspoken tension, thick enough to choke on. Elon adjusted his jacket, his voice steady but guarded. He started talking about the truck's battery, how it could outlast a gas engine. The audience clapped, but Jimmy cut in, his tone sharp as a blade. He asked about factory conditions, tossing out words like exploitation and greed. Elon's jaw tightened. He explained the safety measures, the training programs, but Jimmy wasn't listening. The host's eyes gleamed with a hunger for drama, not truth. He twisted Elon's words, painting a picture of a heartless boss who cared only for profit. The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through the seats. Elon leaned forward, his voice low but firm. He asked Jimmy why he was pushing this narrative, why he ignored the facts. Jimmy laughed, a cold, hollow sound, and waved a hand like he was swatting a fly. He said the show wasn't about boring details, it was about entertainment. The word landed like a slap. Elon's fingers gripped the armrests, his knuckles white. He hadn't come here to be a punching bag for Jimmy's ratings. The host leaned closer, his smirk widening, and accused Elon of dodging responsibility, of hiding behind fancy tech talk. The audience gasped, sensing the storm brewing. Elon's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting through the noise. He called Jimmy out, saying a real man faces his guest with honesty, not cheap shots. Jimmy's face flushed red, his cool act cracking. He snapped back, calling Elon arrogant, a know-it-all, who thought he was above everyone. The words flew like fists, each one landing harder than the last. Elon stood, his chair scraping the floor, and pointed at Jimmy. He said he'd trusted him to have a fair talk, but this was a setup, a circus for Jimmy's ego. Jimmy shot to his feet, his voice booming over the crowd's roar. He shouted that Elon didn't get to call the shots here, that this was his show. The cameras zoomed in, catching every snarl, every clenched fist. The tension was a living thing, coiling tighter with every word. Elon didn't back down, his voice like steel. He said Jimmy had betrayed his trust, lured him here with lies about a friendly chat. The crowd was on edge, some cheering Elon, others egging Jimmy on. The stage felt like a battlefield, and neither man was ready to surrender, just as Elon started. To expose Jimmy's game, the host slammed his hand on the desk, cutting him off. He yelled that Elon was out of line, that he'd regret disrespecting him. The audience held its breath, the air electric with rage. Elon's next words were calm, but deadly, promising to reveal the truth about Jimmy's tactics. Before he could finish, Jimmy barked at the crew to cut to commercial, his face twisted with fury. The screen went black, but the fight was far from over. The real war was just beginning, and the world was watching. Can a man's truth survive? A stage built on lies. The studio lights flared back on, the crowd's roar filling the air like thunder. Jimmy Kimmel stood behind his desk, his smile gone, replaced by a scowl that could curdle milk. Elon Musk hadn't sat down. He loomed at the edge of the stage, his eyes locked on Jimmy, burning with a fire that refused to dim. The commercial. Break hadn't cooled the fight. It had only poured fuel on the flames. The audience leaned forward, split between cheers for Elon's defiance and shouts for Jimmy to take him down. Elon spoke first, his voice clear and sharp, slicing through the noise. He said Jimmy had invited him to talk about progress, about building a better future, but instead set a trap to tear him apart. He revealed Jimmy's team had sent him friendly emails, promising a fair discussion, only to ambush him with accusations. The crowd gasped, some booing Jimmy, others yelling for Elon to prove it. Jimmy's face twisted, his hands balling into fists. He snapped that Elon was making it up, that he was just a whiner who couldn't handle tough questions. The insult landed like a punch, and Elon stepped closer, his boots heavy on the polished floor. He said Jimmy wasn't a journalist, he was a bully hiding behind a microphone. using his show to destroy people for applause. The audience erupted, half cheering Elon's courage, half egging Jimmy on. Jimmy leaned over his desk, his voice dripping venom. He called Elon a fraud, a rich man pretending to care about the world while his workers suffered. He mocked Elon's dreams of space, saying he was just a boy playing with rockets. Elon's face hardened, but he didn't shout. He said Jimmy's words were empty, that he'd never built anything, never risked anything, only torn others down to feel tall. The crowd roared, the divide growing sharper. A man in the front row stood, yelling at Jimmy to apologize, while a woman nearby screamed for Elon to leave. The tension was a tightrope, and both men were walking it with knives drawn. Jimmy, his eyes wild, stepped out from behind his desk, closing the gap between them. He jabbed a finger at Elon, saying he didn't belong here, that he was too big. For his boots. Elon didn't flinch, his stance like a wall. He told Jimmy to back off, that he wasn't scared of his cheap tricks. The crowd held its breath as the two men stood inches apart, Jimmy's finger trembling with rage, Elon's eyes daring him to cross a line. The crew froze, cameras locked on the standoff, the air thick with the threat of something worse. Jimmy hissed that Elon was ruining his show, that he'd regret stepping foot in his house. Elon shot back that Jimmy's house was built on lies, and he'd tear it down with the truth. Just as the crowd thought fists might fly, Jimmy spun away, storming back to his desk. He grabbed a stack of papers, waving them like a weapon. He claimed they were proof of Elon's shady deals, lies he'd prepared to bury him. Elon laughed, a sharp, bitter sound, and called the papers a prop, a coward's way to dodge a real fight. The audience was a sea of noise, some chanting Elon's name, others hurling insults. Jimmy, his face red with fury, threw the papers down and shouted for security. He said Elon was done, that he was throwing him out. The crowd surged, the chaos peaking as security guards appeared, their faces grim, moving toward Elon. But Elon stood tall, his voice rising over the storm, promising, "Jimmy, this wasn't the end. What does it take to silence a man who won't bow to fear?" The studio pulsed with chaos, the crowd's shouts crashing like waves against a cliff. Two security guards, broad-shouldered and stone-faced, closed in on Elon Musk, their hands hovering near their belts. Jimmy Kimmel stood behind his desk, his chest heaving, a triumphant sneer twisting his face. He thought he'd won, that he could bury Elon with a wave of his hand. But Elon hadn't moved an inch, his feet planted like roots, his gaze locked on Jimmy, daring him to push further. The guards stopped short, unsure, as Elon raised a hand, not to fight but to command attention. His voice boomed, steady and fierce, cutting through the crowd's roar. He asked the audience if they wanted truth or a circus, if they'd come to hear ideas or watch a coward's game. The room split, some cheering wildly, others jeering. But more voices joined Elon's side, chanting his name. Jimmy's sneer faltered, his eyes darting to the crowd, seeing his control slip. He slammed his fist on the desk, yelling for the guards to drag Elon out to end this mess. Elon turned to the audience, his words sharp and clear. He said Jimmy didn't care about them, that he'd lied to get Elon here, twisted facts to make him a villain, all for a few extra viewers. He pointed at the guards, saying they weren't the enemy, just men caught in Jimmy's trap. The crowd roared louder, some standing, clapping, their anger turning toward the host. A woman near the stage shouted that Jimmy was a fraud, and the "E-buddy" chant spread, a tide of defiance. The guards hesitated, glancing at each other, their resolve cracking under the crowd's fury. Jimmy's face turned purple, his voice shrill as he screamed for quiet. He accused Elon of turning his show into a riot, of disrespecting his house. But the words sounded hollow, desperate. He grabbed his microphone, pacing the stage like a caged animal, and made a fatal mistake. He insulted the audience, calling them sheep who'd follow any loudmouth with a fancy car. The crowd gasped, then booed, the sound like a storm breaking. Even Jimmy's loyal fans turned, their cheers fading, replaced by glares. Elon seized the moment, his voice calm but piercing. He said the audience wasn't sheep. They were people who wanted honesty, who believed in dreams bigger than a talk show's ratings. He spoke of his factories, his workers, the real people he fought for, not the cartoon villain Jimmy painted. The crowd erupted, clapping, stomping, their energy a living force. Jimmy cornered, threw his microphone to the floor, the crack echoing through the studio. He shouted at the crew, blaming them for letting this happen. His cool mask shattered. The guards stepped back, refusing to touch Elon, their faces tight with unease. The audience was a sea of raised fists and voices, chanting for truth, for Elon to stay. Jimmy, wild-eyed, lunged for a phone on his desk, yelling that he'd call the police, that he'd have Elon arrested for disrupting his show. The threat hung heavy, a spark in a room full of dynamite. Elon didn't blink, his voice rising one last time, promising the crowd that no one could silence a fight for what's right. The studio shook with their cheers, but Jimmy's hand trembled. On the phone, his next move a gamble that could destroy him. How far will a man sink when his empire starts to crumble? The studio was a furnace of noise, the crowd's chants for Elon Musk shaking the walls. Jimmy Kimmel clutched the phone, his knuckles white, barking threats about calling the police to haul Elon away. His voice cracked, betraying the panic beneath his rage. The audience jeered, their boos a relentless wave, drowning his words. Elon stood tall, arms crossed, a quiet strength radiating from him, his eyes never leaving Jimmy, who looked smaller. With every shout, Jimmy dialed, his hands shaking, yelling into the phone for officers to come quick, claiming Elon was inciting a riot. The crowd's anger surged, a man in the back shouting that Jimmy was the one causing trouble. A woman threw a crumpled program at the stage. Others followed, littering the floor with paper. The crew, usually invisible, stirred uneasily. A cameraman lowered his lens, shaking his head, while a stagehand whispered to another, their faces tight with disgust. Jimmy's own people were turning, his control slipping like sand through his fingers. Elon stepped to the stage's edge, his voice rising, clear as a bell over the chaos. He didn't shout, but every word carried weight. He told the crowd Jimmy's threats were a coward's last stand, that he'd rather call the law than face the truth. He spoke of trust, how he'd come here believing in a fair fight, only to find a snake waiting to strike. The audience roared approval, their claps like thunder. Elon turned to Jimmy, his gaze sharp, and said a real leader owns his mistakes, not buries them under lies. Jimmy dropped the phone, his face a mask of fury and fear. He stormed toward Elon, screaming that he was nobody, a fake hero who'd crash and burn. The words were desperate, hollow, and the crowd saw it. They chanted louder, demanding Jimmy apologize, their voices a tidal wave. The guards still lingering backed away completely, refusing to side with Jimmy. A producer in the wings shook her head, muttering about the show's ruin. Jimmy's world was collapsing, and he had no one to blame but himself. Elon raised a pubby hand, silencing the crowd, his presence commanding respect. He said he didn't want Jimmy's apology. He wanted people to see the truth, that Jimmy used his stage to hurt, not help. He spoke of his workers, his dreams for a better world, not for fame but for progress. The audience listened, rapt, some wiping tears, others nodding fiercely. A man yelled that Elon was the real deal, and the cheers shook the rafters. Jimmy, cornered, tried to interrupt, but his voice was lost, a squeak against the crowd's power. This stage lights flickered, as if the room itself felt the shift. Jimmy staggered back to his desk, his shoulders slumped, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. He tried one last jab, muttering that Elon would never be welcome here again. The crowd laughed, a sharp, bitter sound, and Elon smiled, not with cruelty but with certainty. He said he didn't need Jimmy's stage, that truth finds its own way. The audience erupted, their applause a wall of sound, as Jimmy sank into his chair, defeated, his dream of crushing Elon in ashes. What rises when a man stands tall against a storm of lies? The studio vibrated with the crowd's thunderous applause, a tidal wave of support washing over Elon Musk. He stood at the stage's center, his face calm but fierce, a beacon in the chaos. Jimmy Kimmel slumped in his chair, his desk a barricade that couldn't shield him from the truth. The audience's cheers were a verdict, their raised hands a salute to Elon's courage. Jimmy's dream of breaking him had shattered, and the wreckage was his alone to face. Elon turned to the crowd, his voice steady, carrying a warmth that cut through the heat of battle. He thanked them, not for cheering him, but for believing, in honesty, for seeing through the smoke of Jimmy's tricks. He spoke of his work not as a boast but as a promise to keep fighting for a world where ideas matter more than ratings. The audience roared, some standing on chairs, others clapping, until their hands stung. A woman in the front row shouted that Elon had won, and the chant spread, a rhythm of victory. Jimmy tried to speak, his voice a weak croak, begging the crowd to listen. He claimed he'd only asked tough questions, that Elon had overreacted. But the words fell flat, swallowed by boos and laughter. The crew, once loyal, stood silent, their faces grim. A lighting tech shook his head, walking off set, while a producer whispered to another about damage control. Jimmy's empire was crumbling, his name tainted by his own hand. The crowd's rejection stung worse than any insult Elon could have thrown. Elon stepped toward the stage's edge, ready to leave, but not before one final word. He looked at Jimmy, not with anger but with pity, and said, "A man's legacy is built on what he creates, not what he destroys." The words landed like a hammer, and Jimmy flinched, his eyes dropping to the desk. Elon turned to the audience, raising a hand in farewell, and the cheers swelled, a sound that would echo beyond the studio walls. He walked off, his stride sure, the crowd's applause following him like a shield. Jimmy sat alone, the cameras still rolling, capturing his defeat. The audience began to file out, some tossing angry glances his way, others talking excitedly about Elon's stand. A man paused to yell that Jimmy should be ashamed, and the host said nothing, his face pale, his hands limp. The show cut to black, but the damage was done. Word of the fight spread like fire, with people praising Elon's strength and condemning Jimmy's betrayal. The host's reputation sank, his show's future uncertain, while Elon's star burned brighter, untouched by the night's venom. Outside, Elon stepped into the cool night air, the crowd's cheers still ringing in his ears. He didn't smile, but his eyes held a quiet pride. He'd come to talk about a truck, but he'd left with something greater, the truth, unbroken, shining for all to see. The world would remember this night, not for Jimmy's fall, but for a man who faced a trap and walked away taller. The story was over, the victory clear, and the future belonged to those who dared to build it.